everybody, my name is Amanda and welcome back to another video. I hope you're all doing okay. Today I want to talk about my degree, which was English Literature at Glasgow University, and I was supposed to graduate this summer, or I am graduating this summer, but there won't be a ceremony, etc, etc, but I'm graduating this summer basically. So to sort of close off that chapter, I guess, I want to talk about some of my favourite books that we have read over the course of these 4 years, and maybe that will give you some inspiration to pick up some new books that you might not have heard of and that sort of thing. So without further ado, let's get into it. Editing Amanda here, just wanting to say that I'm currently in Sweden and all my books are in Glasgow, which is why I can't hold them up or show them to you. Some of them I've also managed to sell back or give to other students because I don't need them anymore. But that's why I'm not really showing any of the books here. Back to the video. So in the first 2 years I was taking English literature, comparative literature, and like a few other outside courses. And the one book that really stood out from all of the comparative literature books that we read from around the world was Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov, and it is to this day one of my absolute favourite books. And if you haven't read it, if you want to dabble into more Russian literature, this one is such a solid place to start because it's about the devil coming to Moscow disguised as just a man, and it contains magical elements and it contains a lot of social criticism, and it's just written in a really beautiful way. To this day, it's one of my absolute favourite novels that I've ever read. Another comparative literature read that stood out to me was Breath, Eyes, Memory by Edwidge Danticat, and this one follows women in Haiti, and the main character moves to the United States after having lived in Haiti, and it's about Haitian culture and it's about trauma, and it's a heavier read for sure, but it's definitely well worth your time because it tells an important story and it does it in a beautiful, really heart-wrenching way. And then a few books that I want to pick out from the early stages of my English lit degree. In the first 2 years you take more general courses like novels or ideology, so we read everything from like Jane Eyre, Great Expectations, like the big texts basically. But the ones that really stood out to me was a Scottish play that's called The Cheviot, the Stag and the Black Oil, which is about the Highland clearances, and it contains a lot of music, and it's very sad to read about this event in UK history that I don't think is talked about enough. Me as an ignorant Swede, I had never heard about the Highland clearances before I came across this novel, and I think it's a really interesting way to approach this historical topic that I think just needs a little bit more attention. And two other books that are from the early stages of my English lit degree, that would be Poor Things by Alistair Gray, and Alistair Gray's kind of championed as the Glasgow writer basically, and this one is a retelling of Frankenstein where the monster is a woman, and it's just a really interesting kind of grotesque look at bodies and gender, and it has a lot of interesting things to say. I think I don't agree with all of kind of the ways that it approaches all these topics maybe, but I think it does it in a really interesting, slightly postmodern way that's just really unique. So moving into the last 2 years where I took more specific courses that I had chosen myself, I have made a little list here of the courses I took. It felt like ages ago now. I took Victorian literature, I took literary theory, romanticism, and a course called 1945 to present, and then there was also a core course which everyone had to take. And my favourite reads from the Victorian lit course was actually Hard Times by Charles Dickens, and I'm a huge Dickens fan, and this one I hadn't really engaged with too much, and I think that's just like a really kind of underrated Dickens read actually. It's very bleak and follows this family in this very industrial town, and it's about their father, Mr. Gradgrind, who is raising them in this very harsh school, and it's about their family and about their lives, and just really interesting read. If you enjoy Charles Dickens, then I would highly recommend it. For core, I think that it introduced me, we didn't read any longer texts for core, but it did introduce me to the short stories of Borges, which is an Argentinian writer, and it's just such an amazing collection. I've since gone on to read more stuff of his and would highly recommend it. He kind of falls in between that modernism and postmodernism style, and they're quite difficult, I think, to engage with, at least for me, because there's so many references that I didn't really understand, but the ideas that he presents are just so interesting and so kind of mind-boggling, I guess, and it will definitely get you thinking. My favourite short story of his is definitely Pierre Minard, writer of the Quixote, which is such an interesting kind of meta story. For the 1945 to present course, I think the book that I really took with me from that course was How to Be Both by Ali Smith, and it really kick-started my love for Ali Smith because I've gone on to read pretty much all of the books that she's published so far, and How to Be Both is definitely one of my absolute favourite of hers. It's one of my favourite books of all time, and it is two different stories, one about a girl in modern times and one about a painter from far back. And the interesting thing about this book is that half of the copies are published with one story before the other, and the other half they're switched and you don't know which one you get when you buy it. And it's just a really interesting concept, and it has a lot to do about grief and memories and gender and storytelling and how we remember things basically. And it's so good, and I would highly recommend it. For my fourth and final year, I took the courses British Children's Literature, and then there was a course about saga literature and Old English poetry and about heroes and outlaws and outcasts in that type of literature. And I took one that was called Realism and Fantasy in Victorian Literature, and there was one course that was called A Fantastic History of the 20th Century. All of these courses were absolutely amazing and we read so many good books, but I've picked out a few of my favourites. So I think one of my favourites from the Children's Lit course was actually The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald, and this is a book that I hadn't really come across before, but it's a very kind of conventional story, but it has a very interesting hero, which is the princess, and it combines a lot of elements from different fairy tales, and it has a lot to say, and there's a lot to work with there. And I think the story is just imaginative, and I think it's from the 1920s if I don't remember wrong, and it just feels pretty modern in the way that it approaches a lot of its subjects, and I really enjoyed it. For realism and fantasy in Victorian literature, I must say that the real surprise for me was Adam Bede by George Eliot, and this is such a big chunk of a book. I think it's like 550 pages of really slow burning realism about this guy called Adam Bede, and he goes about his life and he falls in love with this girl, and it's basically just everyday kind of normal village life, and it's just so beautifully written. And there's this famous chapter in this book which is basically George Eliot's manifesto on realism and what she thinks that literature sets out to do, and there's a lot of ideas to engage with there, and how literature should represent real life or not represent real life, and the role of the author and the narrator and everything like that. So there's definitely a lot to unpack there, and the story is just really pleasant and enjoyable and not dull at all. And the last book that I want to talk about that I really enjoyed was from my Fantastic Histories of the 20th Century course. We read one book from each decade up until now. So we got to read Tolkien and Le Guin and just a lot of canonical texts that helped shape the fantasy genre basically. But the one that stood out to me was The Third Policeman by Flann O'Brien, and this is an Irish writer and he's written under several pseudonyms, and this one is just a mind-boggling fantasy that just doesn't make sense, and it's such an intriguing read because you have no idea where it's going, and this world is just, you don't know how the pieces fit together. You don't really get what's going on. You don't really know if this is all in his head, if it's fantasy at all, or whether it's just this kind of nightmarish vision basically. And I think that is really interestingly written, and it has a lot of quirks in the writing style, and Flann O'Brien is just a really interesting writer in itself, and this one was actually not published until I think 40 years after he wrote it. So I hope that this video found you well and that you got to pick some interesting reading ideas from it, because an English lit degree, when I look back upon it, is not really what I'd expected, because you don't just read all the big classics. It's not only Jane Eyre and Great Expectations and Frankenstein. And I think in English lit degree is an excellent opportunity to get to explore these lesser known titles that might in themselves have had a huge impact on smaller reading communities and that sort of thing. Please share your own book recommendations in the description box below if you have any that you think I should read, because I'm constantly on the lookout. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a big thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the Unite Students YouTube channel. I will see all of you guys in my next video, so stay tuned. Bye.